Hey guys, my name is Myth or Mythology. If you aren't familiar with me, I write the Icy Veins Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker guides. I've played in a ton of the Race the World First guilds, Liquid, Pieces, BDG when those guilds are still around, unfortunately. And I also frequent some of the class discords. You can see me posting and giving my thoughts. But for this video, we're going to be looking at Holy Paladin and the War Within Alpha. Keep in mind, this is the alpha, so a lot of this information that I'm kind of talking about or discussing can change, and it's very likely to change. This video is kind of just my initial thoughts on the talents, how they might play out, how they're going to interact within the Holy Paladin kit, what are my concerns, what are the things I like. So don't take my opinion too seriously, right? A lot of it is my opinion and what I think, my initial impressions. So you might disagree. There's parts that I say suck and you think might be good. There's parts that I really, really like that you might not enjoy as much. But again, it is my impressions. It's early alpha. Some of it can change, but I hope you guys enjoy the content and can learn a little bit. All right, starting with Herald of the Sun. The most important talent here is going to be Dawnlight. Most of the other talents kind of interact with it or play around it. So it's definitely the most important one to kind of understand and make sure you have a good idea of. Basically, Holy Prism and Barrier of Faith, they're now a choice node since Lightshammer has been removed. Barrier of Faith has been moved to the choice node with Holy Prism. Pressing those abilities will cause your next spender, or sorry, two spenders, to give you the Dawnlight buff. Just does healing over time, but it also contributes to some other talents that we're going to talk a little bit later. Starting with Gleaming Rays and Morningstar, both of which, again, interact directly with Dawnlight. Morningstar is going to cause your next Dawnlight do increased healing. Stacks up every 5 seconds. The main problem that I kind of envision with this is that sometimes the extra healing is not really needed. It kind of depends on the situation you are, but I think its value is going to be a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes having that extra Dawnlight healing is going to be really, really powerful, right? But other times, especially in periods of low damage or low healing and all that stuff, you're not going to need its value as much. But on the other hand, Gleaming Rays, whenever you have a single Dawnlight active, you're going to do 10% more damage and healing from your spenders. So my early impressions is that Gleaming Rays is definitely pretty strong. While 10% isn't a big deal by itself, you're able to kind of have Dawnlights up pretty consistently, especially during wings, is the main thing, right? When you're in wings, you're going to have a ton of Dawnlights out. So you're going to have 10% extra healing for all of your wings duration. Not to mention also just the damage, right? So even if you're using wings for damage, you have those Dawnlights out, you're just doing 10% more like Shield of the Righteous damage, which can add up to be quite a bit. Next talents, we have Will of the Dawn and Illuminate. So both these talents, not super important, basically utility, movement speed stuff. Realistically, I think you can kind of go with whatever. This one, the most benefit it comes from just increasing your allies' movement speed with Dawnlights. And then Will of the Dawn is just kind of personal movement speed. So I think they're more relevant to kind of PvP and maybe Mythic Plus settings. Benefit of this is you can at least control the movement speed a little bit more in a Mythic Plus setting. Just because there's less targets that can actually receive a Dawnlight, right? Rather than having a 20-man raid. The impact of having movement speed increase on one of those players is not going to be as big compared to Mythic Plus. But realistically, I think you're probably just going to play for your own movement speed most of the time. Especially because when you're out of Divine Steed charges, you're really not that immobile. Then Aurora basically just gives you Divine Purpose. Nothing too exciting. Again, it triggers off of your Holy Prism or your Barrier of Faith, so they've kind of changed these two abilities to be much more prevalent in the kit. Currently on retail, there's a lot of situations you run to where you're not really pressing Holy Prism or Lightshammer on cooldown, even with the tier set. But now it's going to be really, really important if you're Herald of the Sun, right? Your goal is to kind of press it on cooldown. It's probably your most important button because you need to get those Dawnlights out and you need to get all those bonuses as much as possible. Honestly, I probably should have started with Eternal Flame, looking back, but it's back. I can't remember when it was last I think maybe Legion, maybe Warlords. Regardless, it replaces Word of Glory. What's really interesting is that my initial concern was that Word of Glory is all upfront healing, right? So I would not want Eternal Flame to be less upfront healing in order to gain that hot healing, because if I'm in a situation like Mythic Plus or where single target healing is really needed, I'd much rather have more upfront healing. The good news is Word of Glory and Eternal Flame have the same upfront healing, so you're not sacrificing any of that burst healing, burst single target healing. You're just gaining healing in the form of a hot. What is also important to note is you're probably going to be refreshing this buff and kind of overwriting it in a Mythic Plus setting. There are a lot of times where I have to kind of spam Eternal Flames in the tank, right? So the hot's not giving me as much value because I'm constantly overwriting it, and I think that's going to be kind of common in Mythic Plus settings. So I don't think you'll focus too much on the actual hot value, but in raid, obviously, you would want to spread it a little bit more. It's also going to be a little bit easier because you won't have to invest as many globals into a single target as you would in a Mythic Plus setting. Then down to a Lingering Radiance and Blessing of... I don't even know how to pronounce that. Let's start with Lingering Radiance. Basically, Dawnlight just leaves an Eternal Flame. Fairly simple. I guess it also does the Greater Judgment effect, which can be kind of relevant. Mythic Plus, but not super important. So then Blessing. Basically, all of our Dawnlights, all of our Hots that we're going to, again, get into a little bit later with, like, Sunseer, just have a chance to increase Holy Shock healing. Viability could be either way. I don't think these talents are too important. Kind of similar to some of these ones on the left side of the tree. I don't think they are what make Heraldless unexciting, so not too big of a deal. Shoulder Grace, another same thing. Basically just a haste steroid. Whenever you get Dawnlights out. Super nice because, again, you're going to have it during wings a lot of the time. So you're just gaining that haste for free. Extra stat, doesn't hurt. Luminosity, pretty standard. Critical Strike, chance increase, not that big of a deal. The big thing that is worth noting currently, right, is that this says Holy Shock and Light of Dawn, and that's concerning because that does not interact with Word of Glory or Eternal Flame, right? So if we keep kind of going down the talent trees, you're going to see us again where Sunseer, Holy Shock and Light of Dawn, and the second Sunrise, Holy Shock and Light of Dawn, right? So one of the big concerns in previous iterations of Holy Paladin was that we kind of got into a gameplay loop where we were spamming Light of Dawn, Light of Dawn, Light of Dawn, and so much power was in our Light of Dawn that if our Light of Dawn was kind of overhealing or not as useful, then we felt kind of useless, right? And also spamming melee with healing, just spamming the melee with Light of Dawns isn't great. Obviously, having Breaking Dawn can help make that healing a little bit more spread, but it's definitely concerning how much power is going to be tied into Light of Dawn. I would definitely like to see these talents kind of also have the ability to proc or interact with Eternal Flame or Word of Glory. That also just helped Mythic Plus a lot, right? Because currently, these talents are kind of dead on arrival for Mythic Plus outside of like the Holy Shock value. Because either Light of Dawn is going to be so OP or just spamming a Mythic Plus, which is highly unlikely. You're going to want the single target healing for Eternal Flame, so it would make sense for them to interact with Eternal Flame. And then Sunseer, Holy Shock, and Light of Dawn critical strikes just add a hot. Again, that goes back to these talents I always forget. Healing over time effects, right? Have a chance to increase, so Sunseer can contribute to that. Second Sunrise, it's back from a talent being pre-rework, where I think originally it was just Light of Dawn had a chance to cast again. Now again, Light of Dawn and Holy Shock. So the Holy Shock chance is quite nice, I would say. I definitely am a big fan of that. But again, not being able to interact with Eternal Flame or Word of Glory kind of sucks. I would say that maybe they're concerned it would be a little bit too strong. Because if I'm in a Mythic Plus setting, our Word of Glory the tank, it's a big single target heal, or at least we hope it is. Hopefully it's tuned that way. And then it procs another Word of Glory. You could be laying handsing the tank, right, with a proc of this. So maybe that's a concern, that it would be too broken. But even I would like to see it on the talent, but maybe even a lower proc chance, right? Just at least some interaction there, because interaction is definitely going to be a big concern. And then the most important talent, the reason that I think Herald of the Sun is so much fun, and honestly, I think pretty powerful. Whenever we press wings, and I've kind of mentioned this earlier, hinted at it, lines come out of your character, and you basically create beams to a bunch of allies, right? It spawns 4 Dawnlights, and you basically radiate healing and damage to any allies or enemies that are in the beams. And honestly, it does so much healing and honestly damage that it is pretty strong, and it feels super satisfying. When you press Avenging Wrath, I think it's comparable to Ashen Hallow back in the day, right? Where you pressed Ashen Hallow and you knew the raid was safe or the party was safe. I'm going to be doing a ton of healing. I think that when you have Sun's avatar active, it's the same kind of feeling. You are outputting so much healing and even damage that that it just feels great. It feels powerful. It feels impactful. I love this talent. It's the reason why I think Herald of the Sun is so powerful. The one concern, though, of course, is that because it is so powerful, you're going to be forced kind of back into Awakening, which if you had liked Awakening, that's good, right? You can be happy. But you're pretty much going to be forced into Awakening because you obviously want to proc Sun's avatar as much as possible. That also means for the people who kind of enjoyed not casting as much in the past, and now they've kind of had to use Flash of Light in the last few patches of retail, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on kind of spending and building holy power, so you might see the rotation kind of change slightly, because we want to be in Awakening and we want to be in Wings as much as possible to get Sun Avatar's uptime as much as possible. Again, I think it's super fun. I think it's one of the most satisfying abilities in the game, honestly. So I'm definitely excited to see how it kind of turns out once we get a better idea of how tuning is going to look. All right, taking a look at Lightsmith, the main component here is going to be Holy Armaments. These are basically a 1 minute cooldown. We get 2 charges of it. 1 minute recharge, I should say, is a better way to think about it. And they're just going to buff your allies. They're going to do shielding, they're going to do damage, they're going to do healing, kind of a bit of everything, but you basically turn into a little bit more of a support-focused playstyle, right? We're trying to buff all your allies, and most of the talents, again, are going to obviously interact with that. The unfortunate thing about Lightsmith, and a huge problem, I think, with general buffing trees like this, is that in a raid setting, it's going to be really hard for the buffs to be as impactful, right? If I'm only buffing 2, 3, 4, 5 players out of 20 people in the raid, that's much less comparable, or much less powerful compared to a Mythic Plus setting where I can cover basically the entire party, right? So these buffs would need to be super strong to be better than Herald of the Sun in a raid setting, but then maybe it's too strong for Mythic Plus then, right? So that's definitely an initial concern, and something we're going to look at in this tree is that a lot of the talents really just don't do a lot for us. Starting with our choice node here, basically, easiest way to explain these two is just going to be kind of comparable to Shaman Shields, Water Shield, Lightning Shield. You just buff yourself up at the start of a dungeon, start of a raid boss, start of whatever you're doing, get a nice weak ore to track it, and they just give you primary stat armor, or then stamina, or stamina and holy power having a chance to do extra healing. It's just tuning, nothing too exciting. But again, that's a lot of the hero talent trees, that some of these are just not going to be that exciting. Laying down arms. Whenever an armament fades from us, lay on hands cooldown's reduced, which is not that great. Maybe useful in a Mythic Plus setting, right, where it's a long kind of 30-minute encounter. We can get more multiple uses. But it does give us Infusion of Light, so we can kind of get consistent Infusion of Light procs, which is kind of good. But the problem you have even now is you have so many Infusion of Light procs that honestly waste a lot of them, so getting more of them is not great. Maybe it could allow you to swap off of Inflow so that you don't kind of need that that safety net for when you're proccing inconsistently, because you're going to have a little bit more procs through this talent. But of course, we won't know that until we get some more raid testing and stuff like that. Shared Resolve. Anyone who has an armament on them is going to have our aura increase, so mainly Devo. Whenever we press Aura Mastery, or we just have Devo selected, it's just going to do 33% more, which is honestly not a lot since Devo has been nerfed so much. Again, that's going to be really impactful in Mythic Plus, right? Where you can kind of consistently target certain players and give them damage reduction through the Devo, but in a raid setting, it's not going to be as great. So Solidarity, whenever you buff an ally, you also gain one of it. Pretty simple. I think it's mainly just there for quality of life. Because obviously, buffing only allies and not getting the benefit would not be as enjoyable from a playstyle perspective. So then we have a choice node, Forewarning, and Divine Inspiration. Divine Inspiration has a chance for us to get a holy armament for a nearby ally. And then Forewarning reduces the cooldown by 20%, right? So a lot of this is just going to come down to proc chance, right? If the proc chance is high enough that you can spawn extra, it's going to be really nice, especially just for coverage purposes, having a lot out at once. But if the proc chance is not good enough, which we won't know until we see, obviously, final tuning, you're ended up just going to be playing for kind of the CDR, right? And just getting more out of that. Valence, assuming Infusion of Light reduces the cooldown. So, again, if you think about Herald of the Sun, where we're playing a lot into Awakening, here it feels like we're going to be playing a lot into Infusion of Light, which is a concern because this tree automatically stands out to me as being a little bit more balanced for Mythic Plus in mind, right? And now we don't really want to be spinning Infusion of Lights in Mythic Plus compared to just slamming Soders or pressing Crusader Strike, right? Because we're only going to be able to reduce or consume Infusion of Light every so often with Judgment. We don't really want to be pressing Flashlight, so that's going to force you into a situation where you might have to press Flashlight just to get the infusion off to reduce your armaments, which I know is not really a desired playstyle for a lot of Holy Paladins, especially in a Mythic Plus setting. You don't want to press Flashlight when you could be doing damage, but unless, of course, the healing is needed. Just depends on the situation. That's definitely an initial concern. So our next choice node, Blessed Assurance and Divine Guidance. This kind of right side of the tree, as you're going to see, is a little bit more damage focused. It really just gives the vibes of these talents are good for Mythic Plus. They're just going to allow you to do more damage. It does actually split healing, or they interact with healing. The problem is just that's going to be down to tuning, right? Like, the actual healing they provide is not going to be that useful unless it's tuned well enough. Whereas in Mythic Plus, any extra damage you get for free from having these talents is beneficial, right? But in Raid, you don't care as much about the damage output. Especially here, we're not going to be casting Consecrate that much in Raid, right? It's a decent enough filler, but it's not a high priority button. So when we're getting talents to interact with Consecrate, that's not really ideal from Raid. Of course, in Mythic Plus, that's great, though. More healing, more damage from pressing Consecrate. Now that button's even better. That's great. That is fantastic. Blessed Assurance. Holy Power Spender increases the damage and healing of your next Crusader Strike by 100%. Again, kind of interacting with the damage side of Holy Paladin. Crusader Strike currently does not really do a great amount of damage, though, so even 100%, I'm probably going to struggle to see that just being better than more Consecrate healing and damage. But of course, it's going to come down to tuning. I definitely think Consecrate, though, and interacting with that's going to be my preferred choice for now. We'll see. Then, again, kind of what I was talking about, how some of these talents just aren't really that useful in a raid setting. Hammer Wrath, slowing targets. Fear effects reduced by 50%, right? PvP talents, very useful, or very rarely going to be useful in a Mythic Plus setting. Probably never going to be useful in a raid setting. Maybe once in a blue moon it will interact on a fight that could be useful, but it feels kind of like dead talents unless you're focused on PvP. I will say the slow component could be nice for Mythic Plus if your tank needs a kite, right? You can drop a Hodge, and you get that movement speed, but 15% is not great, especially for 5 seconds. So I think it's mainly just going to be a nice PvP benefit. So then we have Hammer and Anvil. Judgment critical strikes deal damage and healing. Additional damage and healing. Again, now we're having the issue where we're going to want to press Judgment already on cooldown because we're likely taking Righteous Judgment, right? So Judgment has a chance to jump Consecrate, which is important. That's a lot of our damage in Mythic Plus. But then we also wanted to use it for Valence and reducing our holy armaments. So then we're gonna have situations where we don't have an infusion of life, but we're gonna want to press judgment for hammer and anvil and for righteous judgment, but then we're not gonna get the CDR on this. So then it's like, okay, now do I have to press flash of light to consume my infusion after I'm done because my judgment's off cooldown? I don't want to sit on my infusion of light because then I'm wasting the CDR, and the CDR of holy armaments can add up to a ton, right? If I'm just sitting on all my infusions, not consuming them. So I don't really like the way those two abilities interact, where you have a talent that makes you want to really press judgment on cooldown, right, through these two. But then we also want it up for infusion of light. And maybe it's actually not going to be a problem once you're actually in a deep Mythic Plus dungeon. Maybe you have so much infusion of light that you never are in a situation where the proc is available and judgment isn't. Or maybe the proc will always be available with judgment off cooldown. The better way to look at it. But there's definitely some initial concerns there, but just how that's going to interact and how they'll play out. And then Blessing of the Forge. Kind of similar to Herald of the Sun. When you press wings, you're just going to gain additional sacred weapons. And these are also going to cast spells on our targets. Echoes the effects of your holy power spenders, right? So now we're back into interactions with Awakening, right? Where we want to be in wings as much as possible. But that's going to cause issues with our GCDs, right? Because do we want to spend... obviously, we're going to press Holy Shock, right? That's our given in every form of content. But now the focus is... after we press our Holy Shock, so we want to press Infusion of Light, or do we want to spend our Holy Power? We have different parts of the kit kind of splitting that decision off. In Mythic Plus, where you're pressing Shield of the Righteous a lot, it's going to feel much better just because you can proc Awakening a little bit more consistently. But in a raid setting, you're going to have a lot more trouble because you're having to decide between spending or consuming infusions. And in Mythic Plus, you can always spend. There's always a good opportunity to spend because you're either doing damage or healing. There's not always a good opportunity to spend in a raid setting. Obviously, you can just hammer a Light of Dawn out when the raid's at full HP, or a Word of Glory out when the raid's at full HP, but that's not really desirable compared to like using Infusion of Light and reducing our Holy Shock cooldown. So a little bit more split in terms of how it's going to play. I would like to see Lightsmith, I don't want to say fully reworked, but I would hope some changes come, specifically like giving us a more interesting talent choice in this regard, right? And then maybe having a little bit more consistency in some of these other talents. But it's still early alpha, and I guess I should say that with Herald of the Sun too. It's early alpha, so a lot of this stuff can change, and it's likely to change. I think Lightsmith is a much higher candidate to actually be reworked or changed than Herald of the Sun. I think Herald of the Sun's at a pretty good spot in terms of enjoyment and power. Lightsmith, I think a lot of people aren't going to enjoy the buffing playstyle. Some will definitely, but I don't think it's for everyone. And I also think it's very clearly focused in a Mythic Plus setting. And in Raid, there just doesn't seem to be much value yet, at least in my opinion. Maybe raid testing comes along and we get some data and that opinion changes. But currently, I don't really see how it's going to outpace Herald of the Sun. And it's also just much less fun, right? So I'd definitely like to see them kind of take a look at this and see what they can do. So overall, I think Holy Paladin is definitely going to be in a really good spot heading into the War Within. There's a lot of reason for optimism, a lot of reason to be excited. Herald of the Sun is one of the most fun talent trees out of any spec, which is great. I think it really gives you that feeling of being powerful during your wings again, right? Which is a feeling I loved back in the day, and it's kind of faded since we've been nerfed so many times and so many interactions have been gutted. But I definitely think the feeling of being powerful during your Avenging Wrath is back, which is key. If you enjoyed kind of Awakening focused playstyles, they're definitely likely to make a return. I can definitely also see casting still remaining, still being a core part of the gameplay for those of you that are really focused on that. There's definitely concern about Lightsmith. A lot of talents that aren't really that great. It's not going to be the most enjoyable playstyle for a lot of players, but I'll definitely keep an eye out on patch notes. If there was a candidate to be changed, Lightsmith could definitely get a lot of changes over the alpha cycle and heading into beta. So we'll see where it takes us, but I definitely think you're a Holy Paladin, you're unsure how to feel heading into the War Within definitely get excited. Herald of the Sun is fantastic.